This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Baruchim haba and welcome everyone. Welcome to Kolel Agra de Pirka, nationwide, Queens, 5 towns, Monsey, Brooklyn, Flatbush, Yerushalayim. Thank you for joining today as we prepare for Parashas Tazria and the Yom Tov of Peh-Sach Haba Aleinu L'Tova. A few very important public service announcements. Firstly, if you don't yet have your Sefer, Magid Rakia on Peh-Sach, now is a good time to get it. Now, I'll tell you, when Peh-Sach is over, you could still get it. It's just, it won't be as timely as if you get it now. Because if you're learning the Peh-Sach Sefer, say, before Shavuos and before Tisha B'Av, see Ephraim, look at Ephraim has a Sefer. It's prominently displayed, I see behind the light and the splendid, what do you, yeah? We'll put Ephraim up there. We'll highlight, yeah, thank you. Thank you for that advertisement. You could go to our site, rabbidg.com, and order the Sefer with free shipping. Take it wherever you are for Peh-Sach. Let's say you plan on going to Egypt for Peh-Sach, you could order it, and this way you have it with you. If you plan on going to Alaska, the North Pole, the South Pole, South America, North America, or if you're going to be home, which is always the best place to be, you can have your Sefer with you. Okay, also, this coming Shabbos, Rosh Chodesh Nisan, we are launching the historic Shaina Halachos program. We're going to be learning a blot of Mishnah Brura a week. 4 shiurim a week, a half a side of a page 4 days a week, and then over the weekend we're going to B'siyata Shema Bli Neder review in the Shaina Halachos of Reb Chaim Kanievsky. So if you're already learning Dirshu, wonderful, we did that last cycle. Now we're going to try to do it a little bit more thoroughly. You could join our group. Go to rabbidg.com and join our group for Mishnah Brura, and this will be a wondrous journey in Halacha L'Maisa of the Mishnah Brura. Okay, let us begin today's shir. We're going to examine the opening of Masechta Psachim. Masechta Psachim begins Or le'arba asar boitkin es hachametz l'or haner. By the light of the 14th, we check for chametz by the light of a candle. And that's a very interesting expression. Or la'arba asar boitkin es hachametz l'or haner. Or la'arba asar. What does that mean, or la'arba asar? So the Gemara ultimately interprets it as the night of the 14th. So the Gemara asks, so just say leil arba asar. Why say or la'arba asar? Says the Gemara, V'tana didan my time aloikatani leil layel. Lishna ma'alya hudenakat. It picked a clean, sensitive expression. Uked Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. The Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, la'olam al yoitzi adam davar meguna mipiv. A person should never emit something lowly, degrading. Now, between me and you, the word night is not the most degrading, demeaning, low word that you could find. And I say that tongue in cheek. What's wrong with night? But it's not completely refined. It has a sort of negative, dark connotation. And therefore, from the fact that the Mishnah used the expression Or la'arba asar, the light of the 14th, as a euphemism, from here we learn the great principle that a person should not let something unseemly, unbecoming come out of his mouth. Where do we learn this from? Says the Gemara, the Torah jumped through hoops, twisted and contorted itself, not to say a davar meguna. From where do we see that? Like it says, min habehema ha-tahira, o min habehema asher einena tahira. It says, from the animals which are tahar, and from the animals that are not tahar. So it could have said min habehema ha-tahira, min habehema ha-tameya. But instead of saying ha-tameya, it said einena tahira. So it said 8 extra words. Instead of saying tameya, it said asher einena tahira. So it said 8 extra letters in order to avoid saying something negative. The Gemara then brings the opinion of Rav Papa. Rav Papa said the Torah even said 9 extra letters in a certain instance. It speaks about a guy, Kiya b'cha ish Asher lo yeh tahar mikra laila. Instead of lo yeh tahar, it could have said tameh. Why did it say Asher lo yeh tahar? The Torah went out of its way to say a cleaner, finer, more refined expression rather than saying this negative expression of tameh. The Gemara then says actually the word tahar is spelled with a vav, so that indicates that there are 10 letters that the Torah went out of its way to say to avoid saying tameh. And then the Gemara brings an example where the Torah went out of its way 16 letters. Rav Ada bar Yaakov Amar Sheish Esrei, like the pasuk says, Mikrehu bilti tahar. It talks about someone who became tameh by having a nocturnal emission, and instead of saying mikre tameh, it says mikre bilti tahar. So there the Torah went out of its way 16 letters. So from here we see that one should, at all costs, try to use the most sanitized, clean, refined, proper expression than using something very graphically inappropriate. For the Gemara gives another example. Tanya debei Rabbi Yishmael la'olam yisaper adam b'lashon nakiya. A person should always speak in a clean language. Why? Sharei bizav kari merkav uveisha kari moishav. When it talks about Tomazav, it refers to the Zav that rides on something, Merkav, riding, and by a woman, instead of saying Merkav, it says Moishav, something she sat on. Why doesn't it say something she rode on? So what the Gemara is saying is that it's inappropriate to refer to something that a woman is on top of as Merkav, something that she rides on, because that insinuates or that connotates that she had to spread apart her raglayim, and just insinuating that is somewhat indecent and immodest. So instead of using Merkav, which could have the connotation of the woman, so to speak, spreading her raglayim, therefore we use a more modest phraseology, namely Moishav. So here the Gemara is telling us the importance of fine speech, and that's why the Mishnah Peh-Sach begins Or la'arba asar boidkin es hachametz. Now, the Gemara in Psachim tells a story about two Talmidim who were sitting in front of Rav. One said, I'm so tired, I feel like a davar acher. A davar acher is a reference to a pig. And one said, I'm so tired, I feel like a goat. Rav would not talk to that Talmud that used the expression davar acher. Then the Gemara says there are two Talmidim who were sitting before Hillel. One of them was Yochanan Zakkai, and some say before Rebbe, and one of them was Rabbi Yochanan. And one said, why do we harvest in purity and we don't? Why do we harvest grapes in purity and we don't harvest olives in purity? And the other one said, why do we harvest grapes in purity and we harvest grapes, we harvest olives bituma? Rebbe said, the one that used the expression tahara or eineno tahara, as opposed to the one that used the expression tuma, I am confident that he will be a Peh-Sach in Klal Yisrael. And sure enough, it was not long until he began to paskin halachos in Klal Yisrael. It's interesting. Here it is. It's not like he displayed extra chachma or extra insight. He just displayed extra, and he exhibited extra sensitivity. Nevertheless, Rebbe was confident. Either Hillel was confident or Rebbe was confident that this midah of refined speech will propel them to great heights in learning. Then there's another incident that the Gemara reports. There were three people who were sitting together. One said that I got a certain amount, I got like a bean's worth. And one said I got like an olive's worth. And one said I got like the tail of a lizard. They searched into the one that used the phrase, the tail of a lizard, and they found, sure enough, that there was some question regarding his lineage. Bottom line, the Gemara speaks at very great length about the importance of refined speech and modest speech and decent speech and not using inappropriate expression. And while this is a very important teaching, and this is a very important lesson, and we know how much the Jewish people value the value of refined speech, what in the world does it have to do with Maseches Psachim? Why is this lesson at the very beginning of Maseches Psachim? We have a rule which is enunciated, articulated by Reb Tzadok HaKohen, who says that he has a tradition that all the statements in the Gemara, even though all the agadatas of the Gemara, even though simply they're just brought in agavorcha, as a side note, as incidentally, coincidentally, but in truth, we have a tradition that they are intimately and fundamentally connected with the Masechta that they are found in. It is not random. It is not just coincidental that a certain Agada to Gemara appears in a certain Masechta. And then Reb Tzadok HaKohen in the Pri Tzadik gives an example. Where in which Masechta speaks about Matan Torah? Masechta Shabbos. Why? It's not a coincidence, because everyone agrees that the Torah was given on Shabbos. Moreover, what perek is it in? It's in perek Rabbi Akiva. Why? Because Rabbi Akiva is the backbone of the Torah Sheba'al Peh. He's the shoresh of Torah Sheba'al Peh. And therefore, since the Torah, everybody agrees, was given on Shabbos, therefore Kabbalas HaTorah is spoken about in Masechta Shabbos, and it's specifically referred to in Perek Rabbi Akiva, who was the source, the shoresh of the Torah Sheba'al Peh. We could add that we know that Talmidei Chachamim are begeder Shabbos, and therefore, of course, it's most appropriate that Kabbalas HaTorah is described and enunciated in Masechta Shabbos. So, bearing this in mind, and in this context, that every Agada to Gemara is appropriately found in the Masechta where it is, in other words, it's not coincidental. Why does Masechta Psachim, which is all about Bedikas Chametz, Biur Chametz, Achilas Matzah, Achilas Marar, the Seder, Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim, all the laws of Chametz and Matzah, we would expect the Masechta to begin with a nice subject relevant to Peh-Sach. And here it is, it speaks about refined speech. What does that have to do with Peh-Sach? So now we're going to examine something very interesting. In the Sefer and the Haggadah Shel Peh-Sach, he brings a very important question. We know the Baal HaHaggadah describes the events of Yetzias Mitzrayim, not really by quoting psukim in Sefer Shemais, but instead quoting psukim in Parshas Kisavai, in the Parsha of Mikra Bikurim. Why does the Baal HaGada bring a proof to the difficulty of the Shibud, Dafka in the Parsha of Bikurim, and not from Shemais? That's the Iker Parsha that describes the Shibud Mitzrayim. And we're going to explain as follows. We know that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu came to Moshe to command Moshe to take Klal Yisrael out of Mitzrayim, Moshe Rabbeinu responded to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He said, Bi Adoini, please my master. Lo ish devarim anoichi, I'm not a man of words. Gam tamal, not yesterday. Gam mishoshaim, not 2 days ago. Gam me'oz dabercha el avdecha. Not from the very first time you began to speak to me. Says the Zohar HaKadosh. What does this mean? Ela raza iu. Here's the secret. Moshe kala. Moshe is the voice. V'dibroi di'iu mila delay. Begalu hava begalusa. His word was in galus. V'hava iu atim lefarsha mila. It was stuffed up from explaining, from clarifying. Uveginda amar. That's why he said, Ve'ich yishmeini parai. How will parai listen to me? Ba'oid de mila dili begalusa delay. How can I be effective in communicating to Parai when my words are in his galus? Daha lesle mila, I don't have words. Ha'ana kala mila gara, di begalusa. All I have is a coil, but I don't have words. From this Zohar HaKadosh we see that so long as Bnei Yisrael were in Mitzrayim, the words of Moshe Rabbeinu were in Golos. And therefore Moshe Rabbeinu says, I'm not an Ish Devarim, because in fact at that time he was not Shalem B'Koyach Diburai. Here we learn that even though we talk about the bondage of Egypt and the slave labor and the pyramids and all the Avodah Kasha, the Chaymer of Uvenim, Beperech, nevertheless on a spiritual plane, the Zohar reveals to us that of all the aspects of the Bnei Yisrael that were enslaved and meshubad, it was their koyach hadibur that was meshubad in Mitzrayim, and therefore says the Haggadah Shal Peh-Sach, Peh-Sach. That is why the king that dominated the Bnei Yisrael, that subjugated them, his name was none other than Paroi, Pera, because he was a bad mouth. He subjugated, enslaved the Jewish people, namely that their koyach hadibur was in Golos. And now we can understand that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu came to Moshe, and Moshe refused to do the mission, to go to Bnei Yisrael, because he said, the Bnei Yisrael are not going to listen to me. So Hashem said, hey Moshe, what's in your hand? And he said, a stick. So Hashem said, throw it to the floor. And he threw it to the floor, and it turned into a snake. And Rashi says, you spoke Lashon Hara on Klal Yisrael. You're following the craft of the snake. Then Hashem said, stick your hand into your shirt. And Moshe did that. And he pulled it out, and it was full of tsaras. So Hashem was showing Moshe twice that by speaking about Bnei Yisrael, he's being over the Yisr of Lashon Hara. But now we understand why this sin is singled out and emphasized. Because that's the whole root of their Golos. Their koyach hadibur is in Golos. Moshe Rabbeinu is an ish kvad lashon, as the Zohar says. The koyach hadibur was in Golos, and therefore Hashem is demonstrating. Moshe, you're a Mitzayra. You spoke Lashon Hara about Klal Yisrael. That you're being toifes of Manasseh shall the Nachash. And now we encounter, unbelievably, the name of this Yom Tif. What is the name of this Yom Tif? Peh-Sach. The Arizal writes in the Pri Etz Chaim, Peh-Sach is a compound word. Peh-Sach, the mouth that speaks. Look at number 22. Peh-Sach, Perush, Peh-Sach, the mouth that speaks. And Reb Eliyahu HaKohen of Izmir, the Baal Shevet Musar. Very interesting discovery. We know in this winter I had the chus to be in Izmir in Turkey. We went to the kever of the Baal Shevet Musar, Reb Eliyahu HaKohen of Izmir. Yesterday, my father-in-law went to visit the kever Avos, and his mother and his mishpacha are descendants of the Baal Shevet Musar. On their kvarim, it all says Nin V'Nechad of the Baal Shevet Musar. So interesting. The Baal Shevet Musar explains what's the significance of Peh-Sach, meaning, says the Medrash Talpios, until now, until redemption, Klal Yisrael's mouth was in Golos, and they couldn't speak. But now that the Torah was given and they were taken out of the Golos, Peh-Sach, their mouth was liberated. Their mouth was freed. And now they can exercise their koyach hadibur properly through the cheros of Mitzrayim. So even though Klal Yisrael, they were free and they were free men and they can now choose to do whatever activities they would like to engage in, but in terms of understanding what really was liberated, says the Arizal, it's Peh-Sach. The Yom Tov of Peh-Sach was primarily the liberation of the koyach hadibur. And therefore, we have some amazing revelations in the Tfer Shloimeh, on the pasuk, Nevuchim heim ba'aretz, Sagar aleim hamidbar. They are confounded in the land. They are locked in the midbar. The word Sagar aleim hamidbar could be read Sagar aleim hamidaber. Their koyach hadibur was locked up. They lost the koyach hadibur. And in fact, the in the Chassam Sofer, in the Shir Ma'oin, descendant of Chassam Sofer, he brings the same remez. They encamped Lefnei Baal Tzifoin Sagar Aleim Hamidbar Hamedaber. Now their Koyach HaDibur, their Diburei Tefillah was locked up. And therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells the Bnei Yisrael, and this is brought in the Sefer Oyev Shalom of Rav Shalom Shapira, he brings Daber El Bnei Yisrael V'Yashuv V'Yachal Lefnei Pi Achiros. Where was the freedom of the Jewish people? Of course, if it's Paroi, subjugating the Jewish people, and Moshe Rabbeinu is Ish Lo Ish Devarim Anoichi, and it's Saga Aleim HaMedaber. So where are they going to be freed? Of course, they're going to be freed in Pi Hachiros, the mouth that goes free. The mouth that goes free. And the Sefer Imrei Avram expands upon this concept. Let me see if I could just find this. 1 second, please. The Sefer Imrei Avram expands about this concept that we know that Paroi subjugated the Koyach HaDibur of Klal Yisrael. He's Para, and therefore Hashem allowed our Koyach HaDibur to be sealed up, Sagar Aleim HaMedaber, and therefore He freed us at Pi Hachiros. And therefore, the night of Mitzrayim, we liberate our Koyach HaDibur. What do? It's called Hamarbe Lesaper B'Yitzias Mitzrayim. Normally, we're supposed to be circumspect in our words. We're not supposed to speak so much. We have a certain limit of words. Nevertheless, when it comes to Peh-Sach, it's called Hamarbe Lesaper B'Yitzias Mitzrayim Hareza Meshubach. Okay, so Reb Tzadok HaKohen has a very interesting read on V'chol Hamarbe Lesaper B'Yitzias Mitzrayim Hareza Meshubach. Namely, it's not just speaking about the events of Yitzias Mitzrayim. He says, in light of the teaching of the Arizal, that in Mitzrayim our Koyach HaDibur was enslaved, and our Koyach HaDibur was in Golos, and that's why Moshe Rabbeinu, who was a reflection of Klal Yisrael, was not an Ish Devarim, then anyone who is Zoiche to perceive and achieve and recognize the light of Yitzias Mitzrayim, he realizes and he senses a certain liberation of the Koyach HaDibur. And therefore, the night of Yitzias Mitzrayim, you could be Marbe Diburim Kertsoinoi. It almost sounds like there's no limit on what you're allowed to talk about. And Rabbi Tzadok HaKohen even says, V'yashuvu v'yachanu l'fnei pi achiros, that on the third day of Peh-Sach, when we started heading back toward Mitzrayim, and the Mitzrayim caused us to come back to Egypt, so the light of the first 2 days dimmed a little bit. So for the first time, v'yashuvu v'yachanu l'fnei pi achiros, now for the first time we need to start considering and thinking a little bit more about what we speak about and how we express ourselves. But the first 2 days, it seems like there's unlimited. There's no limit on what we are allowed to speak about. But this is the idea in the view of Reb Tzadok HaKohen. Now, based on what we're saying, that in Mitzrayim we were Sagar Aleim HaMedaber, and Moshe Rabbeinu was an Ish Kvad Peh Kvad Lashon, and when we were freed, it was Peh-Sach. It was the mouth that speaks. We liberate our Koyach HaDibur, and that occurred at Pi Hachiros. This gives more meaning into that which Chazal teach us, that the reason why Klal Yisrael was redeemed from Mitzrayim is because they were Zohir in Lashon Hara. Chazal say in Vayikra Rabbah, B'shvil Arba Dvarim Nigalu Yisomi Mitzrayim, Shaloi Shinu Es Shemam, V'yas L'shoinam, V'loi Amru Lashon Hara. They did not change their names and their language, and they did not speak Lashon Hara. Because as we know, that's the whole reason, that's the whole objective of the Geula, that our mouths were liberated. So it's no wonder then that we were redeemed in the Zuchus, that we did not speak Lashon Hara. Now perhaps we can understand why when Klal Yisrael left Mitzrayim, the pasuk says, "U'lechol b'nei Yisrael lo yecharatz kelev l'shaynoi me'yishvat isha." No dogs barked at the Jewish people when they left Mitzrayim. Of what significance is that? Of what relevance is that? Who cares that no dogs barked when we left Mitzrayim? And we could explain, because the Gemara tells us in Psachim that anyone who's mesaper lashon hara, and anyone who's mekabel lashon hara, and anyone who testifies falsely, you should throw them to the dogs. By the way, you think it's a coincidence that this Gemara appears in Psachim? Of course not. Of course it's significant that this Gemara appears in Psachim. Because Peh-Sach is all about liberating the Koach HaDibur. So what Gemara is going to tell you what happens to those who abuse the power of the Koach HaDibur? Of course it's going to be a Masechta Psachim, and none other than Arvei Psachim. Now, therefore, if the Bnei Yisrael, when they left Mitzrayim, they left b'zchus that they didn't speak Lashon Hara, so now we know they're not roi l'hashlicha l'klavim. They're not fit to be thrown to the dogs. And therefore, they were zoiche that when they left Mitzrayim, l'chol b'nei Yisrael lo yecharatz kelev l'shoynoi l'mei ish v'yad behema. Now we understand something very interesting. When Moshe Rabbeinu saw Dasan hitting Aviram, Moshe Rabbeinu said, and they said, "Hey, who do you think you are? Mi samcha leish sar v'shoifet aleinu halahargeni ato omer kasharagdas Mitzri. Who do you think you are? Are you going to kill me like you killed the Mitzri?" And Moshe was afraid, and Moshe said, the matter is known. Rashi explains, Moshe was afraid that he saw that they were Balei Lashon Hara and Klal Yisrael. He said, maybe they're not roy to be redeemed. And Rashi quotes the Medrash that Moshe Rabbeinu said, now I understand that which I wondered about. What sin did the Jewish people sin from all the 70 nations to be subjugated with difficult labor? But now I see they're worthy of it. Question: why of all Averos that caused the Koishi Hashibud, the difficulty of the Shibud, and prevented the redemption of Mitzrayim, why was Lashon Hara the top choice? Says Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger, he says something very interesting. He says that whenever you need to correct something, you always have to rectify at its core. He says something very interesting. We perhaps may have said something else. He said the root of Golus Mitzrayim and Shibud Mitzrayim was Lashon Hara. But listen to this, not the Lashon Hara that you would have thought of. The Lashon Hara that the Mitzrim spoke on Bnei Yisrael, that they said, Hava nischak maloi. Let's deal wisely with the Bnei Yisrael, because you know what the Bnei Yisrael will do? They'll turn their backs on us, they'll join up with the enemy, and therefore we have to think about what to do with the Jewish problem over here. So Hava nischak maloi, the Lashon Hara that the Mitzrim spoke about Klal Yisrael, that is the Avera that brought us into Galus. Which is interesting. So if we're going to get out of that Galus, we have to correct the sin of Lashon Hara of the Mitzrim. You see, I would have said the sin of Lashon Hara that brought us into Galus was the Lashon Hara that Yosef HaTzadik spoke about his brothers. But he refers to the Lashon Hara that the Mitzrim spoke about us. And therefore, because Lashon Hara threw us into the Galus, Moshe Rabbeinu said, okay, we're never going to get out of here, because if there's still Deilo Tyron and Klal Yisrael, tattlers, then we're going to have a hard time being masakin the infraction at its root. Mav Rabbi Sai comes a Sfas Emes, and the Sfas Emes says something really astounding and outstanding. He says, that's the inyan of the Daled Koisos and Achilas Matzah. We have 4 cups of wine and eating matzah. The 4 cups of wine correspond to the 4 lashonos of Geula. And the achilas matzah and the daled koisos, they correspond to the 5 faculties of the mouth. We know there are 5 ways to produce sound. There's the throat, the palate, the teeth, the tongue, the lips. There are chamesh moitzois hapeh. So the 5 mitzvahs of the Seder, the 4 kaisais and achilas matzah correspond to the chamesh moitza'os hapeh. So we learn, friends, that rectifying the koach hadibur is a very fundamental part of Yitzias Mitzrayim. The Galus and the Shibud of Mitzrayim was our koach hadibur was in Galus. Our koach hadibur was subjugated. So Moshe, our leader, reflected our state, and he was not an ish devarim. And therefore the king that subjugated us was Paroi, Peh-Sach. And therefore was Sagar Aleim Hamidbar, Hamidaber. Our faculty of speech was locked up. But when we went free at Peh-Sach, the mouth of freedom, and we became the Dar Hamidbar, the Dar Hamidaber, because our faculty of speech was freed. And therefore the Yom Tif is called Peh-Sach, the Arizal says, the mouth that speaks, explained by the Shevet Musar, Rabbi Yoel HaKohen of Izmir. And the idea that Peh-Sach is a compound word of Peh-Sach is already found in the Balei HaTosfos, the Moshav Zakenim, and Parashas Emor. Now, Marv Rabbi, here's the clincher. So, comes the night of the Seder, and we want to make sure that we're putting ourselves on a program to rectify our koach hadibur. So we say, Kadesh, you want to sanctify yourself. Orchatz, you want to wash yourself. Karpas, Klal Rishon Peh-Sasum. Rule number 1. Close your mouths. Kadesh, Orchatz. The Klal Rishon is Peh-Sasum. The first rule is silence your mouth. But the Vishnitzer Rebbe took this further. But if you say, come on, that's very hard to be Karpas, Klal Rishon Peh-Sasum. I gotta talk. We say you gotta talk, Yachatz Magid. Then just say half of what you need to say. You can't fulfill Klal Rishon Peh-Sasum, Yachatz Magid. Cut in half what you want to say. But then we say further. We say, Peh-Sach Matzah Umar. Peh-Sach, you're going to open your mouth and you're going to talk. Then you know all that's going to lead to is matzah and marar, strife and bitterness. And that's something that we all know. Most people rarely regret something they didn't say, although yes, it could happen. More often than not, they regret something that they did say. In fact, Rabbi Sai, the Bas Ayin, Rabbi Avram of Avarish, Rabbi Avram Doiv of Avarish, Talmud of Rav Levi Yitzchak Barditchev. He's buried in Tzfas near the Levushe Sra to have the zchus to be at his kever in Tzfas and to speak in a shul. The Bas Ayin, he brings that before anybody speaks, there has to be the chachma that precedes the speech. The chachma that precedes the speech is like the Shabbos. Shabbos is bechinas chachma that precedes the Peh-Sach, the mouth that opens. And he says Shabbos Hagadol is the machshava before the Peh-Sach. And that's the meaning what Chazal say. If Klal Yisrael would preserve 2 Shabbosos, they would be redeemed immediately. The 2 Shabbosos are the Shabbos of Machshava and the Shabbos of Dibur. That's the meaning of Shabbos Hagadol, the Shabbos before Pesach, which represents thinking before speaking, is Gadol, is more important even than the speech itself. The Bas Ayin says, let's read this inside. Shabbos before Pesach is called Shabbos Haggadah because of the miracle. We know that a person has to guard their mouth from speaking secular speech on Shabbos, certainly not to speak Dvarim B'Telim or Shar Diburim, and you have to be more careful than even during the week, and this is called Pesach. But there is another Bechina, and that's the Bechina of Machshava, to guard one's thoughts, that they should always be Davak B'Hashem. And this is called the Shabbos, the Bechina, the dimension of thought before speaking is the dimension of Shabbos before Pesach, and that is why it's called Shabbos Haggadah. Marv Rabbi, so if the Yom Tif of Pesach is the Yom Tif that we were imbued with a heightened ability to speak, and that's why we elevate our Koyach HaDibur on Pesach with the mitzvah of Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim, where we elevate our mouth with Achilas Matzah. Because until then our mouth wasn't Golos, and it was Koyach Sagar Aleim Koyach HaMedaber, and we were subjugated by the Perah, and we went to freedom by Piach Hirois. What pasuk in the Chumash articulates the ability, the power of speech of Klal Yisrael? HaKoil Koil Yaakov, HaYadayim Yidei Esav. The voice is the voice of Yaakov. What day of the year were Klal Yisrael told the power of the voice of Yaakov, of HaKoil Koil Yaakov? We know that was the day that Yaakov went to steal the brachos. And what day was that? Of course, Chazal tell us that he brought Yitzchak, Shnei Gedoye Izim, because it was Peh-Sach. So the night of Pesach, Klal Yisrael was for all time taught, HaKoil Koil Yaakov, the Hayadayim Yidei Esav. We were taught the great power of the speech and the ability to speak of Klal Yisrael. Marv Rabbi, now we understand why Masechta Psachim begins with the importance of refined speech. Don't speak about the night. Don't say night. Say Or La'arba Asar. Don't say a lizard's tail. Don't say Tameh. Use a much more refined, elegant way to speak. What does that have to do with the Yom Tov of Pesach? Rav Tzadok HaKohen teaches us that where a particular Agada to Gemara is placed, reveals to us the essence of the Masechta. I'll give you two examples. What Gemara speaks about Churban Beis Hamikdash? Masechta Gittin. Gittin. Which parak? Parak Hanizakin. Damage. Why? Because the Churban Beis Hamikdash was like God being Megarish us. It was a disconnect. It was a breakup between us and Hashem. What Masechta do you think? What Masechta do you think? What Masechta do you think will talk about the Churban Beis Hamikdash? Of course, Masechta Gittin. And what Masechta talks about the importance of Eretz Yisrael and the greatness of Eretz Yisrael and the love of Eretz Yisrael? Ksubis. Because just like the ksuba is, so to speak, the bond of love between husband and wife, when we're zoicha to be in Eretz Yisrael, that's like the bond of love between us and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And now we understand why the Masechta of Psachim opens up with the importance of refined and elegant speech. Because in Mitzrayim, our Koyach HaDibur was enslaved. It was subjugated. It was meshubad. And through the Pi HaChirois and freeing ourselves from the Perah, and we were saved from the Sagar Aleim HaMedaber. We elevated our Koyach HaDibur, and therefore the most appropriate and logical Masechta to teach us the importance of Koyach HaDibur and how it has to be used in the proper fashion is Masechta Psachim Peh-Sach, the mouth that speaks. So as we prepare for this great Yom Tif, we think about how we were put in Galus through Lashon Hara, how we were redeemed by being Zahir in Lashon Hara, and this is an appropriate subject for, of course, this week, Parashas Tazria, the Parasha of Tsaras, which is a punishment for Lashon Hara, and by elevating our Koyach HaDibur, we should be Zoicha that Ki meitzeischa me'eretz Mitzrayim arenu neflois, just like Hashem redeemed us from Mitzrayim, Hashem should once again show us great miracles with by elevating and redeeming Klal Yisrael v'vias kol tzedek v'mher v'yameinu. Amen. Thank you everyone for coming. Have a terrific day.
Thank you.
Baruch Tia. Thank you.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.